2005 on picturesque Kickett Island, about 50 miles north of Seattle, Washington.
Kickett Island is this small private island in the Puget Sound. It was this idyllic place. It was kind of a paradise.
This serene haven is home to 41-year-old, one-time Junior Olympic equestrian, Linda.
Linda is the daughter of a very wealthy businessman. In fact, her dad owns Kickett Island.
Linda was tall, beautiful.
She is rugged and outdoorsy and really kind of looks like the natural beauty.
14 years earlier, Linda met her husband, local celebrity dog trainer, Mark Stover, when she hired him to train her dog. 53-year-old Mark is heralded as the dog whisperer of the Pacific Northwest.
He started building up a clientele of people who would bring their dogs to him. He had a long list of high-end clients.
I think of him as a larger-than-life man. When he loved big. And when he was angry, you knew about it.
Mark and Linda have a lot in common, including a shared love of the outdoors. But their relationship hasn't always been plain sailing.
When Linda first met him, she thought he was rather arrogant. But eventually, with his kind-heartedness and his charisma, he won her over, living with her for almost 11 years before they decide to tie the knot.
Together, the happy couple runs Island Dog Adventures, an upscale dog boarding kennel that caters to their wealthy clients' pampered canines. But their life on the island paradise is about to become a living hell. By the middle of 2005, Mark and Linda's 3-year marriage is showing signs of strain.
She was gone a lot doing equestrian sports.
Linda claims she and Mark argue over money, even though their million-dollar business is booming. And over time, the fights between them become increasingly nasty and aggressive.
At a certain point, Linda feels like she can't take it anymore.
Worn out by the constant squabbling, Linda decides it's time to end her 14-year relationship and packs a bag to leave. But when she tells her husband of the decision, his growing anger finally boils over.
Linda says he just turns into this thing she hasn't seen before.
Why can't we just talk about that?
He's clenching his fists. He's visibly shaking. He is about to erupt.
It's clear that Mark did not want to get a divorce and that Mark loved Linda very much. I believe truly that she broke his heart when she decided to leave.
Mark's extreme reaction terrifies Linda.
She was probably unprepared for the extremely rash behavior of Mark, and it left her very afraid for her safety.
Convinced she's doing the right thing, Linda makes her exit, leaving Mark furious and desperate. While she waits for the divorce to go through, Linda settles 150 miles away from Kickett Island, across the Cascade Mountains in Winthrop, Washington.
She feels this sense of relief. Now she can kind of start thinking about her future and going forward in her life without Mark.
She wants to feel safe, and finally, she does. She's far enough away, starting a whole new life. She's happy.
Linda feels she's now finally free from her soon-to-be ex-husband's aggressive demands. But despite the distance, it quickly becomes clear that starting over isn't going to be as easy as she'd hoped. One day, Linda is contacted by the last person she hopes to hear from. Hello? Mark.
He's not happy, and he wants to try and save the marriage. And it's not just one call. It's call after call after call. And these are not nice calls.
Linda worries that Mark's rage will make it unlikely they'll reach an amicable divorce.
Mark's angry messages make Linda very uneasy. She wants this to end peacefully, but it's very clear that Mark isn't going to respond in kind.
But how far is he willing to go to get what he wants? Mark's threatening calls, Linda feels better knowing there are over 100 miles between them.
Where she lived was described as being remote. Her house was in an isolated end of a long driveway type of location with no close neighbors.
But she's about to learn that when it comes to a scorned lover, distance is no obstacle. On the morning of October 16th, 2007, as Linda's getting out of the shower, there's a loud noise.
Linda said that she heard her dogs barking and she looked out her window.
She looks towards a hill behind her house, and she's stunned by what she sees.
She said she spotted somebody on the hill with a rifle. The rifle was pointed right at her house with a person looking through the scope at her.
She's just gotten out of the shower. She's there vulnerable, naked, frightened, and wants to know who this is that's taking an aim at her.
Linda thinks the man on the hill bears a resemblance to her ex, Mark.
Linda takes a closer look and determines that this is not a guy who looks like Mark. This is Mark. And he's looking at me through the scope of a rifle.
But although she's left feeling powerless and terrified, Linda is reluctant to involve the authorities.
She said that she didn't report everything because she thought it was going to exacerbate Mark, and she was trying to deal with it on her own.
She probably thinks that she is the best person to know how to control Mark or deal with these temper flare-ups.
She chooses to keep the incident to herself. But will this fateful decision prove to have disastrous consequences? 3 days later, as Linda's getting ready to go out, she's confronted by an even more bone-chilling sight. Only this time, it's right in front of her.
Evidently, Mr. Stover was standing in her house as she got out of the shower.
What are you doing here?
He's not outside the window. He's not on a hill. He's in the room right next to her.
I just want to talk, okay?
And he is begging. He is desperate. He wants to save this relationship, save this marriage.
Why can't we just...
According to Linda, Mark's emotional pleas quickly become aggressive.
He grabs her by the shoulders, and he's saying, I can't let you go. I'm not going to let you go. It was frightening.
Linda desperately tries to turn the situation around by pacifying her hostile ex.
Somehow she calms him. She gets him out of the house.
The incident is a wake-up call that reminds Linda that things between her and Mark are far from over.
She was hoping that Mark would just go away and she would have this new life.
But that wish will never come true. Not if Mark has anything to do with it. By November 2007, it's been over 2 years since Linda left Kickett Island. She claims she's exasperated by Mark's stubborn refusal to let her go.
Linda realizes that she really has to move forward with this divorce, which has been kind of drawn out. Now is the time. She's got to move on.
One night, while out to dinner, she finds another powerful motivation to finally close the door on her troubled marriage. The owner of the restaurant happens to be one of Mark's oldest friends, and he stops by her table to say hello.
Mark had a really good friend named John. They had been friends for 35 years. He was the best man in their wedding.
As they start to chat, both John and Linda feel a strong chemistry flare up between them.
During the course of the dinner, John gets kind of chummy with Linda. After dinner, they decide to get to know one another a little better.
So later that evening, the pair find themselves back at John's place.
According to Linda, if there was a spark of attraction at the restaurant, it really ignited into a flame once they met up after dinner. Chemistry is undeniable. This is an extremely liberating moment for her. She wants to believe that this is the beginning of a completely new life.
As they become intimate, the last thing on Linda's mind is Mark. She believes he's hundreds of miles away.
Linda and John are so caught up in the passion that they're experiencing during their encounter that they are oblivious to anything that might be happening around them.
But unbeknownst to the preoccupied lovers, they might not be alone. Could there be an unseen threat lurking in the shadows, watching their every move? The stakes are set for Linda and John's lustful affair to come to a sudden and dramatic end. Linda has left her husband, well-known dog trainer Mark Stover, but her jilted spouse refuses to let go. According to Linda, he's been relentlessly harassing her ever since. Now, 2 years after their separation, Linda finds herself in bed with John, one of Mark's oldest friends.
Linda and John are in the bedroom, enjoying one another, very focused on one another.
Her encounter with John is a groundbreaking, almost watershed moment where she feels that she can launch into a new, romantic, blissful, sexually satisfying encounter and leave the last chapter of her life behind.
But for Linda, the euphoric feeling of being free is about to come to a screeching halt. At 7:30 the next morning, Linda is back at home when the phone rings.
Linda answers.
Hello?
And it's Mark. He seems a little more agitated than normal, she feels.
Linda claims Mark refuses to accept the terms of the divorce and demands even more money from the settlement. Then the conversation takes a disturbing turn.
According to Linda, he decides to quiz her about her activities from the night before. Hey, what did you do? Where were you?
Linda says she is increasingly frightened by Mark's hostile tone, but it's what he has to say next that really chills her blood.
Mark starts kind of detailing the events of the evening.
He talks about her dinner, the restaurant she was at, her friend, the wine on the table.
Linda is horrified as she realizes Mark is recounting every detail of her romantic evening.
He describes what she's doing in her intimate moments with John, and the conversation becomes more intense. Is he watching her constantly? Does he know her every move?
She's terrified. How could he possibly know these intimate details about her life?
It leaves her scared and wondering what her jealous ex might do next. Convinced Mark was spying on her the night before, Linda decides to investigate.
She went over to John's house and saw an area where a car could have been parked.
What she says she finds are tire tracks that are the same kinds of tracks that would be made by Mark's vehicle. And she also finds shoe prints that she says would have been made by the exact same shoes that Mark wears.
Linda's worst nightmares are slowly coming true, as it appears her ex is determined to ruin her new life. Days later, her new lover weighs in on their prospects as a couple.
If Linda's sexual attraction for John had given her hope of a new relationship, a new life beyond Mark, those hopes are dashed when John sends Linda a letter saying that Mark's stalking behavior has him equally upset and he does not want anything more to do with Linda.
He says, I really fear for my own safety and for my kids.
Finally, Linda reaches a breaking point and vows to take action to stop her stalking ex once and for all. But how far is she willing to go to protect herself? First, she has her house rekeyed and deadbolts put in. Then, she installs a new security system. And convinced that her life is in danger, she even goes one step further by informing the local sheriff.
We came to her house, reviewed her security measures. She'd installed security cameras around her house, and we gave her some suggestions on where to place those.
But there's a limit to what the authorities can do.
At that point, they didn't have any evidence. It was all he said versus she said.
With no other option, Linda takes matters into her own hands and becomes fully equipped to confront any threat with full force.
There was a firearm within reach anywhere you went in the house. Just everywhere there was firearms.
Linda even has a gun mounted to the wall behind a tapestry within arm's reach of where she lays in bed at night.
At this point, Linda doesn't hesitate to call the police whenever she fears Mark is lurking in the shadows. But her overzealous precautions will ultimately lead her down a very dangerous and deadly path. In a surprising turn, in January 2008, Mark finally agrees to the divorce settlement. But according to Linda, even though their marriage is now over, Mark refuses to move on, and instead becomes preoccupied with getting his hands on one specific memento from their past.
Mark Stover was obsessed with these wedding photos of him and Linda together. He made numerous calls about wanting him back.
Listen, I want you to go through every single thing that you own and look for those photos. There's no reason you should have them.
For Mark, it's really about taking them away from Linda. If she doesn't believe in the marriage, if she doesn't care enough about him, she should not have anything to remind her of the sanctity of marriage that he still believes in.
Linda tells Mark she no longer has the photos, hoping that this will be enough to end his obsessive badgering. And finally, on January 14th, 2009, after 2 years of hostility, the ordeal finally comes to an end, and Mark and Linda's divorce is finalized, leaving Linda anxious to get her life back to normal.
She feels completely emancipated. Her brain is clear from that constant pall of worry that Mark might show up. She can move forward, date whoever she wants, sleep with whoever she wants. Linda is a free woman.
But little does she know, her persecution is far from over. In the early hours, one morning in March 2008, Linda's security camera captures the image of a mysterious man lurking outside her house. It seems that the divorce hasn't ended Mark's jealous obsession with his ex-wife, and an already volatile relationship is set to take a very violent turn. Linda claims that since leaving her husband Mark a few years earlier, he's been stalking her. She's now newly divorced from the famed Northwest dog trainer and trying to start a new chapter without him. But just as she thinks she's free, the threat becomes more dangerous than ever. Linda's security camera captures the image of a man walking towards her house in the early hours of the morning. She's convinced the trespasser looks exactly like Mark.
If Linda is correct, if it really is Mark walking around her house at 2:30 in the morning, what does this mean? Is he still psychologically obsessed with her? Wants to always be somewhere in her presence?
Linda is once again gripped by fear. But it won't be long before Mark's harassment gets him in serious trouble. Later that day, a neighbor discovers a stranger rummaging through the trash at the end of Linda's driveway.
This neighbor, knowing that Linda's going through all these issues with an ex-husband, goes and confronts him. Says, "Who are you and why are you doing this?"
The man doesn't identify himself, but the neighbor is sure it's Linda's ex, Mark.
The neighbor is like, this doesn't track. I'm going to call Linda and see what she thinks about all this.
Before Linda can get there, Mark disappears. But he's tracked down by the sheriff a little while later and taken into custody. Although he's been caught 3 bags of Linda's garbage, Mark is convinced he's done nothing wrong.
He admits that he was at Linda's place, and his position is that garbage on the curb is public property, and he's allowed to go through it.
But the officer doesn't agree.
He was cited, got a ticket for theft.
And when the facts are reviewed, police quickly uncover the nasty history between Mark and his ex-wife.
The prosecutor said, this is more than someone stealing garbage. This is a stalking case.
To avoid a trial, Mark reluctantly pleads guilty to the stalking charge. And even though he has no criminal record, he's given the stiffest sentence allowed.
He got a year's probation. He also got a month of electronic home monitoring. And there was also an automatic domestic violence protection order put in place for 2 years.
The protection order also means Mark has to give up some of his most cherished possessions.
He was forced to give up all of his guns. He loved guns. He was a hunter, fisherman, and he had to give his guns to a friend.
Will the police intervention now force Mark to leave Linda alone? Or will it spark a rage greater than anything she's seen before? On March 18th, 2008, Mark Stover turns 56. But on this day, celebrating is the last thing on his mind. Instead, he leaves a distraught message on Linda's answering machine.
When you have one partner stalking the other, this incredible pain is being stirred up by the idea that they're going to be alone again. If they feel they have done everything right, they've played by the rules, they have been loyal, they have been loving, what could they have done wrong?
As Mark struggles with the emotional aftermath of the divorce, Linda worries that she may still be the target of his malice.
She thought he might be suicidal. She felt like he had the potential to hurt her and himself.
Is this an idle threat? Or is Mark really thinking of killing himself? And even worse, taking someone else down too? By mid-spring, a couple of months have passed since Linda last heard from Mark. But in her most vulnerable moments, she still fears for her safety. To calm her anxieties, she has her home assessed by 40-year-old weapons and security specialist Michael Oakes.
Michael writes gun articles. He had more than 200, and he calls it force-on-force training, sort of close combat. And he said that he trained a lot of police officers in how to use that.
But the protection expert cuts a far from intimidating figure.
Michael is probably 5'6". He probably weighed 120 pounds, 110 pounds. He's a real small guy. He just seemed a little intimidated by being around anybody else. He was more of a recluse type person.
Michael becomes Linda's new confidant as she shares her harrowing experiences of being harassed and threatened by her ex-husband.
Linda handed over some sort of dossier on all of the things that Mark was supposedly doing, and she was asking for help or protection or inquiring as to whether the security measures she had taken were enough.
For now, Michael is her gallant protector, making Linda feel safe and secure. But he'll soon take on a much more personal role. 2 months later, the Skagit County Sheriff's Office receives inside information, alerting them to a pending drug deal. The caller identifies the dealer as having the last name Stover.
There's an anonymous call that Mark Stover supposedly is going to be delivering drugs on this specific day, at this specific time, driving this specific vehicle. And you get a tip like that in the sheriff's office, you investigate.
The next day, the deputy sheriff finds Mark in his car.
They pull Mark over. They inspect the vehicle.
An initial search turns up nothing. But on closer inspection, the policeman discovers something highly suspicious.
Underneath the vehicle, in a metal box, are a couple of joints and some low-grade cocaine.
What is this box?
Mark appears to be shocked.
His claim is that he does not have any knowledge of the drugs that they found.
That's not mine. Why would I put
And the deputy sheriff is inclined to believe him.
The circumstances are so odd. You know, this magnetic box, it could have been put there by anybody. It just doesn't seem realistic that he was going to be doing some sort of drug deal.
It wouldn't be too big a stretch of the imagination to think if someone's going to plant it on a locked van, that'd be the easiest way to do it.
The evidence just doesn't add up, so no charges are ever filed. But it leaves Mark worried that someone is now out to get him. Is this a straightforward act of retaliation? Or does he need to prepare for an all-out war? By summer's end, Linda is spending much of her time with her new guardian, Michael. After meeting several times for coffee, their relationship has developed into something more than friendship.
They strike up this romantic relationship. They're kind of an odd match because Linda is quite a bit taller than him. He has 4 kids, a single dad. She's never had any kids.
A genuine and caring partner might be just what Linda needs after everything she's been through. But has she really put her safety in the hands of the right man? Around 8 a.m. on October 28, 2009, one of Mark's employees, Stephanie, arrives for work. While tending to the dogs at the kennels, she sees Mark wearing his signature hat and jacket off in the distance.
She saw Mark's station wagon backed up to the door, and she saw him carrying things out from the house into the back of the station wagon.
Stephanie watches as Mark gets in his car and starts down the driveway. But there's something about his behavior that's definitely unusual.
She noticed that the station wagon went zipping down the driveway very quickly.
And she's left puzzled about where Mark is going. A few minutes later, she makes her way up the driveway.
Stephanie went up to the house to use the bathroom. The door was unlocked.
As she walks in, she's hit by an unmistakable stench.
Immediately, the smell of bleach was just overpowering, and she knew something was wrong.
Even more alarming is what she sees in front of her.
She noticed some droplets of blood on the rug.
Stephanie wonders if the blood is from Mark's dog, Ding, who recently had stitches after surgery.
She thought that Mark maybe was rushing to the vet to take care of an emergency with Ding, which would explain him rushing out of the driveway like he did.
Seeing no sign of the dog or his master, Stephanie leaves, sensing something strange has happened. Did Mark make a mad dash to get help for his beloved dog, or has she just stumbled upon a crime scene? Mark Stover was last seen in the early morning hours, loading something into the trunk of his station wagon. But when an employee discovers drops of blood and an overwhelming smell of bleach in his house, she's worried for his safety. As the day wears on, Mark's employees are increasingly puzzled. Mark is usually in touch constantly, but no one has seen or heard from him since he drove off hours earlier.
Mark had several appointments that day in Seattle, and Mark didn't make any of his appointments. That was very odd.
His staff try his cell phone repeatedly, but there's no answer, and he doesn't return their calls. Might their boss have followed through on the suicidal threats he left on his ex-wife's voicemail? The The next morning, Stephanie returns to work, expecting to find her boss back at home. But when she's confronted by Ding, it becomes clear Mark's guard dog has been in the house all along.
When Stephanie saw Ding alone without Mark there, she knew something had gone wrong because he would never leave her alone.
Most alarmingly, the dog appears to have been shot and is bleeding.
Ding wouldn't allow Stephanie to get close and would growl and be aggressive toward her.
Stephanie tries again to reach Mark, but there's still no answer. And now, certain that more drastic measures need to be taken, she calls 911. Within minutes, the Skagit County Sheriff detectives arrive.
The first thing that they notice is this smell of bleach. The house appears to be immaculate. They notice some wet spots on the carpet and a vacuum with a tubing that's out.
As they continue their search, they find traces of blood on the walls and carpet.
Between finding blood and bleach and people not hearing from Mark, they think right away that something bad has happened, that there was foul play involved.
And it's not long before police get their first big lead. As word of Mark Stover's disappearance spreads, one sheriff remembers a phone call he received the previous day that now takes on grave importance.
They see a couple of cars parked in this area by a community building that's normally locked. Normally nobody's supposed to park there.
The women observed the man transferring an item from the station wagon to the SUV. It appeared to be large, and it was wrapped in plastic.
At the time, police ran checks on both vehicles, and it emerged that one was registered to Mark Stover. The day before, the deputy tracked down the driver of the other car.
He saw a black SUV matching the description, so he pulls over the car.
The driver was identified as Linda's boyfriend, Michael Oakes.
Just pulled over to make a phone
Michael said that he had pulled over to the side of the road to make a phone call.
call. I didn't know that.
Although Michael appeared nervous, at the time, the sheriff had no reason to doubt his story.
Sorry about that.
He notices that the back is kind of full of stuff, but he didn't have any reason to search the car. He warns Michael about trespassing and lets him go.
But now, a day later, the officer realizes that the man he had detained for trespassing may well be connected to Mark's disappearance. Investigators find Michael at Linda's house,
Well, Mr. Oakes, the reason I'm here is because...
but when they move in to question him, they immediately notice his demeanor is off.
It wasn't the normal Michael Oakes that we had contact with. Usually he just sits in the background, doesn't say anything. This time he was more vocal.
Detectives ask Michael what he was doing near Mark's house the day before.
You could see him like wheels turning, and he started getting really agitated and really restless.
He says that he was over there and that he was visiting his ex-wife.
As detectives continue to question him, he grows noticeably edgier.
He's a little flustered, seems he wants to just get out from in front of these cops.
Medication is in my car.
And he says, I gotta get my medicine. It's out in the car.
Michael heads out to his vehicle, but he has no idea he's being observed by one of the sheriff's deputies out on the deck.
I see Michael outside the vehicle. I see him grab a white grocery plastic bag from the vehicle, and I confront him. He immediately throws that bag over the embankment. It's a 25-foot embankment.
The deputy scrambles down the embankment in search of the bag. What is Michael so desperate to hide? And could it hold the key to Mark Stover's ominous disappearance? Northwest celebrity dog trainer Mark Stover is missing, and his ex-wife's boyfriend, Michael Oakes, has been spotted with his car. Now he's just been caught trying to dispose of a mysterious bag that may give cops a lead into Mark's disappearance.
The deputy was really suspicious of what Michael was doing, and so he goes down the embankment and collects the bag.
What he finds inside is alarming.
They found a .22 caliber Browning pistol and a carpet swatch that smells like bleach.
There was now probable cause to arrest Michael Oakes for murder, so we arrested him.
With Oakes in custody, investigators get to work building their case against him. Since Mark is still missing, there's no evidence of how or even if he was killed. So they begin with a hunch.
Michael Oakes was responding to Linda's fears that in spite of the fact that he'd been found guilty of stalking, that she was still in grave danger of Stover coming and doing her harm, possibly killing her. So the theory is that he had decided that he was going to remove this threat from her life.
To support their suspicion, detectives start piecing all the evidence together, including some incriminating declarations Michael made to his former wife on the day Mark went missing.
Mr. Oakes indicated that if the police saw what was in his car, he would be going away for life.
Investigators also discovered that Oakes was seen at a store near Mark's home around 5:15 a.m., where he bought camouflage clothing, a backpack, some weights, and rope, which police believe he used to dispose of Mark's body.
We know that he had the body in his car at that time because the two women who saw him at the Grange described seeing him transferring something that was about body-shaped in plastic from the one car to the other.
On September 29th, 2010, Michael Oakes finds himself in court charged with Mark Stover's murder. But he's far from ready to admit he's to blame.
The defense position was that Mark was obsessive about getting back these wedding pictures of himself and Linda.
Did you bring the photos?
We don't have the photos.
So what are you doing here?
I came to talk about Linda. You have to leave her alone. You have to stop harassing her. Get out of my house! This out. We have to work this out. Listen. Get out of my house.
Oakes claims that an attempt to convince Mark that the wedding photos were destroyed ends in a fight, during which he's shot. Fortunately, his life is saved thanks to a bulletproof vest. Michael says he was then able to disarm Mark and, acting in self-defense, shoot him to death with his own gun. But the prosecution disagrees, stating that when Michael went round to Mark's house, he had no interest in placating him.
There's no indication other than Mr. Oakes' words at trial that there had been any kind of communication, contact, or anything between Mr. Oakes and Mr. Stover.
They suggest, in fact, he had something much more ruthless on his mind.
Prosecutors believe that he bought the supplies that he needed and went over there. He shot Ding. And then shot Mark.
Shell casings recovered from the scene add weight to the case building against Oakes.
Ballistics showed that those casings matched the gun that Michael had tried to dispose of. Detectives believe that those casings matched the bullets that were found in Ding.
There was also Mr. Stover's DNA in the blood from Mr. Stover's house and Mr. Stover's station wagon.
The prosecution also claims that Michael was spotted fleeing the crime scene by Mark's employee, Stephanie.
He cleaned up and took Mark's body and put it into Mark's own car, put on Mark's hat, and pretended to be him while he drove Mark's car out of the driveway. He then went to the Grange and got his own car, transferred the body, and then disposed of the body somehow, though they still have never located it.
According to the prosecution, the bullet found in Oakes's Kevlar vest came from his own gun, indicating that he shot himself after the murder to corroborate his fabricated account.
I think that Mr. Oakes left with the plan to execute Mr. Stover.
On October 22, 2010, after deliberating for 3.5 days, the jury convicts Michael Oakes of Mark Stover's murder.
We really have no idea what happened to Mr. Stover, other than it appears likely that he was shot, and we know that Mr. Oakes is the one that killed him. If the body were to be recovered, that might tell us exactly what happened in the house. It might tell us all manner of things that Mr. Oakes would not want us to know. I think that whether Linda genuinely believed she was in danger or not, that's what she expressed to Mr. Oakes. I think that Mr. Oakes wanted to prove himself to be her savior, her knight in shining armor. He was going to save her and keep her safe from this awful man that she's been describing.
Even with Michael Oakes behind bars, many questions remain in this twisted tale of jealousy and revenge.
I think it's really hard to make sense of this murder because Mark Stover had not had any contact with Linda whatsoever for the prior 18 months.
Mark and Linda seemed to have it all. You know, they owned this island, they had a successful business, they seemed to be in love. I think, you know, for two people to spiral this far out of control and to end in a tragedy like this, people just want to know why. There are so many questions, and I don't think they'll ever be answered.
The Pacific Ocean, even in our modern era of satellite tracking and instant communication, remains a vast, formidable, and deeply isolating expanse. It is a body of water so immense that it can swallow storms, ships, and human ambitions without leaving a single trace on its glassy surface. Now, strip away the technology. Erase the digital maps, the radio frequencies, and the engines of steel. Wind the clock back to the late 18th century, to a time when the world was still a canvas of incomplete lines and terrifying blank spaces. In this era, venturing into the uncharted waters of the Pacific was not merely a journey of distance, but a leap into the absolute unknown. It was a realm where the magnificent ideals of the European Enlightenment were destined to collide with the raw, uncompromising, and unpredictable realities of isolated worlds. This is the story of such a collision. It is a narrative not of malice premeditated in the dark, but of a tragedy born from the very best of human intentions, a fatal miscalculation of cultural dynamics, and the desperate, primal need for survival. In the year 1785, the halls of Versailles were awash with the grand visions of King Louis XVI of France. The French monarch, observing the immense success and the geopolitical advancements achieved by rival nations through oceanic exploration, was determined to cement his country's legacy on the global stage. He authorized and heavily financed a massive, unprecedented expedition to circumnavigate the globe. This was not conceived as a mission of violent conquest or military subjugation. Instead, it was an endeavor deeply rooted in the philosophical spirit of the age. The mandate was one of economic expansion, meticulous cartography, astronomical observation, and profound scientific discovery. France was to send its finest minds into the void to measure the stars, catalog the flora and fauna, and establish peaceful, mutually beneficial trade relations with the indigenous populations they might encounter. The Crown spared no expense, assembling a wealth of scientific instruments, highly trained academics, and seasoned mariners to execute this monumental vision. To carry the weight of France's ambition, 2 magnificent ocean-going frigates were selected and meticulously refitted for the arduous journey ahead. The first was the flagship, the Boussole, placed under the direct command of the expedition's supreme leader, the highly respected Commodore Jean-François de Gallup, the Comte de La Pérouse. La Pérouse was a man of immense experience, possessing a sharp, analytical mind and a deep sense of responsibility for the lives entrusted to him by his king. The second vessel was the L'Astrolabe, commanded by La Pérouse's closest confidant and dearest friend, Captain Paul Antoine Fleuriot de Langley. De Langley was a seasoned naval officer, but beyond his maritime expertise, he was a profound humanist. He was a commander who viewed his crew not merely as the muscle required to operate the sails, but as human beings whose health, morale, and very survival were his ultimate, sacred duty. The deep bond of friendship and mutual respect between La Pérouse and de Langley was the psychological anchor of the entire fleet, a unified leadership that would guide the hundreds of men through the darkest and most terrifying stretches of the open sea. For over 2 years, these floating fortresses of wood, canvas, and iron traversed the globe, navigating treacherous storms, charting unknown coastlines, and pushing the boundaries of human endurance. They were isolated floating cities, carrying a microcosm of French society, including cartographers mapping the invisible, botanists sketching the bizarre, and spiritual figures like the expedition's chaplain and naturalist, Father Louis Receveur. However, beneath the grandiosity of their scientific achievements lay the grim, inescapable biological reality of long-distance oceanic travel in the 18th century. A silent, relentless killer stalked the damp, poorly ventilated lower decks of the Boussole and the L'Astrolabe. That killer was scurvy. Before the mechanics of vitamin C deficiency were fully understood by medical science, scurvy was the ultimate terror of the mariner. It was a disease that slowly and agonizingly unraveled the human body. It began with profound, debilitating fatigue, moving relentlessly into the swelling and putrefaction of the gums. Healthy teeth would loosen and fall from the jaw. The skin would bruise at the slightest touch, and old, long-healed scars would horrifically tear open and bleed anew as the body lost its ability to maintain its own connective tissues. Scurvy did not simply kill a sailor, it dismantled him piece by piece while he was still breathing. The only known cure, the only salvation from this agonizing decay, was fresh sustenance from the land. Fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, and above all, abundant, clean, fresh water were not merely provisions to these men. They were the literal difference between life and a slow, rotting death. This profound medical desperation is the critical context required to understand the mindset of the expedition's leadership as they navigated the vast, empty stretches of the Pacific. Every island spotted on the horizon was not just a geographic discovery, it was a potential lifeline. By December of 1787, the expedition had reached the Samoan archipelago, slowly approaching the island of Tutuila, which is known today as the main island of the United States territory of American Samoa. From the decks of the towering French ships, Tutuila must have appeared as a breathtaking emerald rising from the endless sapphire sea. Its volcanic peaks were draped in dense, vibrant tropical foliage, and its shores were lined with pristine sands. It was a vision of absolute paradise, a stark contrast to the endless, punishing monotony of the open ocean. The ships cautiously navigated toward the coastline, eventually finding what appeared to be a suitable anchorage at Fagasa Bay. The initial contact between the European explorers and the indigenous Samoan population was marked by a cautious but seemingly mutual curiosity. The French, adhering to the peaceful mandate laid down by King Louis XVI, initiated trade. They offered manufactured iron tools, beads, and cloth, items of immense practical and novel value to the islanders. In exchange, the Samoans provided the desperately needed fresh food: coconuts, breadfruit, pigs, and poultry. For a few fleeting days, the grand Enlightenment vision of peaceful, cross-cultural exchange appeared to be a resounding success. The transactions were peaceful, the atmosphere was ostensibly friendly, and the immediate threat of starvation and severe malnutrition was temporarily alleviated. However, Beneath this fragile veneer of harmonious commerce, a deeply unsettling dynamic was beginning to take shape. The presence of these two massive, alien vessels had drawn the attention of not just the immediate coastal villages, but of communities from across the island's interior. Day by day, hour by hour, the number of indigenous people gathering along the shoreline and paddling out in outrigger canoes grew exponentially. They were no longer simply curious traders. They were becoming an overwhelming, unmanageable presence. Commodore Leperouse, observing the situation from the quarterdeck of the Bussole, felt a profound, creeping sense of dread. His extensive experience in commanding men and assessing risks sent off alarm bells in his mind. He observed the sheer arithmetic of the situation, hundreds of heavily outnumbered French sailors surrounded by thousands of islanders. He noticed a subtle but undeniable shift in the demeanor of the locals. The initial awe was evaporating, replaced by a growing assertiveness, a lack of fear, and a brazen insolence that bordered on hostility. Some islanders began to act aggressively, attempting to board the ships uninvited, demanding more goods, and showing little respect for the boundaries the French attempted to establish. For Leperouse, the equation was clear and terrifying. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, the environment was highly volatile, and the risk of a catastrophic confrontation was escalating with every passing minute. His commanding instinct was absolute. They needed to weigh anchor, catch the wind, and leave Tutuila immediately, before the fragile peace shattered completely. Yet, there was one critical, lingering problem that anchored them to the dangerous shore. While they had secured food, their stores of fresh water remained dangerously low. The water they had managed to procure was insufficient for the long, unpredictable voyage that lay ahead toward the Australian continent. This brings us back to Captain de Langley, the commander of the L'Astrolabe. During the surveying operations along the coast, de Langley had made a discovery a few miles to the west of their current position. He had found a small, sheltered inlet known as Asa Bay, and more importantly, he had located a pristine, fast-flowing stream of fresh, sweet water cascading down from the volcanic hills right onto the beach. When Leperouse issued the order to prepare for immediate departure, a tense and fateful debate erupted between the two lifelong friends. Leperouse argued vehemently for their lives, pointing to the massive, restless crowds and the palpable tension in the air. He insisted that no amount of water was worth risking the entire expedition in a hostile, unpredictable environment. He wanted to sail away and take their chances finding water on another, less populated island. De Langley, however, looked at the situation through the lens of a deeply empathetic commander. He looked at his men, exhausted, their bodies teetering on the edge of scorbutic collapse. He knew the horrors of scurvy intimately. To leave without filling every available cask with that pure, life-giving water at Asa Bay felt, to him, like signing a death warrant for his crew. He firmly believed that the fresh stream at Asu was the key to their survival for the next leg of their journey. De Langley pleaded with his superior, arguing that he only needed a few hours. Just one afternoon, a swift, heavily armed excursion into the bay with the ship's smaller boats, a quick loading of the water casks, and a rapid retreat back to the safety of the heavy frigates. He was convinced that with a disciplined show of force and a rapid execution of the task, they could secure the water without instigating violence. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the humid tropical air. On one side, the cold, calculated risk assessment of a brilliant commodore who sensed an impending doom. On the other, the desperate, humanitarian plea of a beloved captain trying to save his men from rotting from the inside out. In the end, the deep bond of friendship and Leperouse's immense respect for de Langley's devotion to his crew forced a compromise. Against his better judgment, against every instinct screaming at him to flee, Leperouse reluctantly capitulated. He gave de Langley permission to execute the water-gathering mission at Asa Bay. It was a decision born entirely of compassion, of medical necessity, and of an unwavering commitment to the welfare of the sailors. Yet, as the sun began its descent on the afternoon of December 11, 1787, and Captain de Langley began to assemble his men and lower the heavy wooden boats into the Pacific swells, He was unwittingly setting into motion a chain of events so horrific, so profoundly violent, that it would permanently scar the history of oceanic exploration. The commanders could not see the invisible trap that nature itself was setting for them beneath the waves, nor could they fully comprehend the sheer scale of the human fury waiting for them on the shores. They were steering directly into a nightmare, sailing blindly toward a picturesque cove that would soon be permanently inked onto the maps of the world under a new, terrifying name: Massacre Bay. To fully comprehend the sheer psychological weight of the catastrophe that was about to unfold upon the shimmering sands of Asa Bay, we must first look closely at the men who stepped into those 4 wooden boats. These were not conquerors. They were not hardened mercenaries seeking to subjugate a foreign land through the barrel of a musket. They were, in essence, the very embodiment of the European Enlightenment, men driven by the pursuit of reason, the expansion of human knowledge, and a profound, perhaps fatal, belief in the inherent goodness of cross-cultural human connection. At the very center of this doomed expeditionary force stood Captain Paul Antoine Fleuriot de Langley. He was a man whose entire command philosophy was anchored in a deep, unwavering empathy for the human beings serving beneath him. In the rigid, often brutal hierarchy of 18th-century naval command, de Langley was a rare anomaly. He did not lead through the application of fear or the threat of the lash. He led through an acute, almost paternal devotion to the physical and mental well-being of his crew. This deep-seated humanism was precisely what had driven him to win the fateful argument with Commodore Lapierre. De Langley could not simply look away from the hollowed eyes and the decaying gums of the sailors who relied on him. The specter of scurvy was a constant, terrifying shadow stalking the wooden corridors of his ship. De Langley, the mission to secure fresh water was not a mere logistical chore to check off a maritime ledger. It was a holy crusade for the survival of his men. When he climbed down the side of the towering frigate and took his place in the leading boat, he did so entirely out of a sense of profound moral obligation, entirely unaware that his supreme act of maritime compassion was guiding him directly toward his own violent end. Beside Captain de Langley in the small boats sat another man whose presence underscored the purely scientific nature of their massive global journey. This was Robert de Laminanon, the expedition's highly esteemed chief physicist and natural philosopher. Laminanon was a man of the Academy, a brilliant mind whose life was dedicated to the categorization of the natural world. He had spent the previous 2 years meticulously analyzing the magnetic forces of the Earth, documenting the atmospheric pressures of unknown latitudes, and studying the geological formations of isolated coastlines from the freezing waters of the North Pacific to the humid tropics. As the wooden boats bobbed upon the ocean swells toward the shoreline of Tutuila, Laminanon was not scanning the horizon for tactical military advantages or hidden threats. He was, in all likelihood, mesmerized by the sheer geological majesty of the volcanic island rising before him. He viewed the world through the rational, analytical lens of science, trusting completely in the power of observation and intellectual exchange. Like de Langley, Laminanon carried no malice in his heart toward the indigenous population. He represented the purest manifestation of the expedition's peaceful mandate, a scholar who firmly believed that the light of scientific understanding could illuminate even the most remote corners of the globe. Joining them among the 61 men chosen for this critical excursion was Father Louis Receveur. Serving the dual role of the expedition's Catholic chaplain and a dedicated naturalist, Receveur provided both spiritual solace and scientific expertise to the exhausted crew. He was a man who sought the divine in the intricate details of the natural world, spending his days collecting botanical specimens and recording the meteorological phenomena of the Pacific. Father Receveur's presence in the landing party was a testament to the comprehensive nature of their mission. They were a microcosm of French society in the Age of Reason. The empathetic commander, the brilliant physicist, the spiritual naturalist, and the dozens of hardened, loyal sailors who provided the essential muscle to row the heavy wooden boats against the unpredictable ocean currents. These sailors were the lifeblood of the expedition, men who had endured unimaginable hardships, violent storms, and the constant, gnawing fear of disease. As they gripped the heavy wooden oars and pulled their vessels toward the promise of the fresh, cascading stream at Asa Bay, their minds were undoubtedly focused solely on the physical relief that the cool, sweet water would bring to their aching, salt-encrusted bodies. The geography of Asa Bay itself is a crucial element in understanding the mechanics of the impending disaster. From a distance, as observed from the decks of the massive frigates, the bay appeared to be a perfect, idyllic sanctuary. It was a deeply indented cove, nestled at the base of towering, steeply pitched volcanic hills draped in thick, impenetrable green jungle. At the very center of this picturesque amphitheater of stone and foliage, a crystal-clear river tumbled down from the highlands, carving a path through the dense vegetation before emptying directly onto a pristine beach of white sand. For men desperately seeking fresh water, it looked like a paradise crafted by Providence itself. It was the exact salvation Captain de Langley had promised his friend Laperouse. However, the true nature of Asa Bay was far more deceptive and infinitely more dangerous. Beneath the alluring, crystal-clear surface of the azure water lay a massive, jagged shelf of ancient coral reef. This coral structure formed a natural, hidden barricade across the entrance to the bay. During high tide, the ocean waters swelled, completely concealing the deadly sharp rocks beneath a safe cushion of deep blue, allowing small vessels to pass smoothly over the reef and onto the soft sand of the shore. But the ocean is governed by the inexorable pull of the moon, and nature is indifferent to the desperately laid plans of men. When Captain de Langley and his 61 men launched their 2 cutters and 2 longboats from the shadows of the frigates, the timing of their expedition aligned with a catastrophic shift in the natural environment. They were approaching the bay exactly as the oceanic tide was beginning to recede. This was not a slow, gentle ebbing of the water, but a rapid, powerful draining of the bay. As the heavy wooden boats, laden with empty wooden casks and dozens of men, pushed closer to the mouth of the river, the volume of water beneath their keels was disappearing at an alarming rate. The massive, submerged coral reef, which had been invisible only hours before, began to breach the surface of the water, exposing a treacherous maze of sharp, unyielding stone. The idyllic sanctuary was rapidly transforming into a geographical trap. Simultaneously, a second, far more terrifying trap was beginning to close around them on the land. As the 4 French boats navigated the increasingly shallow and dangerous waters, the pristine, empty beach of Asa Bay began to change. Word of the foreign vessels and their magical, iron-wrought treasures had spread through the dense interior networks of the island with the speed of a lit fuse. By the time the French oarsmen were making their final approach to the shore, they were no longer looking at an isolated watering hole. They were staring at an overwhelming sea of humanity. An estimated 1,500 Samoans had descended from the surrounding villages and mountainous trails. They covered the entire length of the white sand beach, their bodies pressed tightly together in the humid afternoon heat. They lined the steep, rocky slopes of the volcanic hills that enclosed the bay on 3 sides. To the 61 Frenchmen sitting in their cramped wooden boats, the visual impact of this massive gathering must have been completely paralyzing. They were entirely enveloped. The geography of the bay formed a natural amphitheater, and the French sailors had unwittingly placed themselves at the very center of the stage, surrounded by an audience that outnumbered them by a ratio of nearly 25-1. The atmosphere within that enclosed space began to undergo a rapid, palpable shift. The initial encounters at Fagasa Bay had been marked by a semblance of order, a mutual curiosity, and the structured exchange of goods. But here, in the claustrophobic confines of Asa Bay, the sheer density of the crowd bred a chaotic, restless energy. The noise of 1,500 voices echoing off the volcanic rock walls would have been deafening, easily drowning out the sound of the ocean surf and the commands of the French officers. The posture of the islanders was noticeably different from the trading sessions of the previous days. The cautious reverence had vanished. In its place was a bold, aggressive confidence, fueled by the staggering advantage of their numbers. They pressed forward toward the water's edge, their eyes fixed on the small, isolated group of foreigners and the boats that carried them. The profound vulnerability of the French position was absolute. They were 61 men armed with single-shot flintlock muskets, weapons that were notoriously unreliable in the damp tropical air and took precious, agonizing seconds to reload. They were trapped in a deep cove, backed against a retreating ocean, with their heavy wooden vessels slowly being grounded upon a jagged coral reef that was emerging from the draining tide like the teeth of a massive snare. Captain de Langley, sitting in the lead boat, was a man of deep intellect and vast maritime experience. As the hull of his vessel scraped ominously against the rising coral, and as he looked up at the towering hills completely black with people, the chilling reality of his monumental miscalculation must have washed over him. He had brought his men here out of love, out of a desperate desire to save them from a slow death by disease. He had promised his commander that he could manage the risk. But as the ocean water drained away, leaving his heavy longboats hopelessly stranded upon the unforgiving rocks, and as the massive, restless crowd surged forward into the shallows, the brilliant Enlightenment commander was forced to confront a terrifying truth. All the science, all the reason, and all the noble intentions of the European age of discovery were utterly meaningless in the face of this raw, untamed reality. The trap had been perfectly set by the alignment of the moon, the hidden architecture of the ocean floor, and the overwhelming demographics of the island. There was no escape. The stage was set, the actors were entirely locked in their places, and the idyllic shores of Asu Bay were about to bear witness to an explosion of violence that would echo across the oceans for generations. The peaceful mission of King Louis XVI had reached its absolute breaking point, and the sands were about to turn red. The air in Asu Bay was thick, saturated with the suffocating humidity of the tropics and the sudden, electric tension of a gathering storm. Inside the trapped French boats, the silence of the sailors was absolute, a stark contrast to the growing, cacophonous roar emanating from the shoreline. As the tide continued its relentless retreat, the boats lay firmly pinned against the jagged, protruding fingers of the coral reef. There was no maneuvering possible. There was no swift escape. Captain de Langley, ever the diplomat and the man of reason, attempted to maintain the facade of peaceful commerce. He stood in the stern of his boat, his posture rigid but his expression masked in a practiced, calm demeanor. He began to reach into the ship's stores, pulling out strings of brightly colored glass beads, metal trinkets, and small mirrors, the currency of their expedition. He distributed these items to the most prominent figures among the islanders who had ventured into the shallow water surrounding the boats. It was a desperate, calculated maneuver intended to appease the local leadership, to demonstrate goodwill, and to secure a path of retreat. For a few agonizing minutes, it seemed as if the plan might actually hold. Some of the islanders took the trinkets, their faces momentarily softening, and the crushing pressure of the crowd seemed to recede just a few inches. De Langley's heart must have lifted, a flicker of hope that his humanitarian gamble had paid off, that the mission to secure water could yet be completed without bloodshed. However, the dynamics of a crowd of 1,500 are not governed by logic or the strategic distribution of beads. The mood began to shift with the erratic, fluid instability of a breaking wave. The focus of the crowd, initially centered on the French and their strange, alluring cargo, suddenly fractured. A commotion erupted near the water's edge, a sudden burst of shouts and frantic movement that rippled through the gathering like a stone cast into a dark pool. In the center of this sudden vortex stood a woman, and the sight of her sent a jolt of panic and anger through those nearest to her. She had been injured, a wound to her eye, sudden, sharp, and bleeding, and the origin of this injury remains lost to the shadows of history. Whether it was an accidental slip, a stray object, or the result of a skirmish between the islanders themselves, the truth was irrelevant. To the crowd, the sight of a bleeding woman was a singular, galvanizing catalyst. The simmering, underlying hostility that Leperouse had sensed days earlier suddenly ignited. The islanders' demeanor changed from curious to predatory. The playful assertiveness transformed into a focused, singular rage. The air, already heavy with heat, seemed to vibrate with the intensity of their collective fury. De Langley, sensing the threshold of catastrophe had been crossed, immediately signal his men to cease the distribution of goods and prepare to withdraw. He shouted orders to the sailors to push the boats off the coral shelf, but the vessels were firmly lodged, their wooden hulls groaning against the unforgiving rock. The Frenchmen, their faces pale and beaded with sweat, strained against their oars, but the boats did not move. It was in this moment of vulnerability, with the French locked in place by the geography of the bay, that the assault began. It did not start with a coordinated volley or a military command. It began with the environment itself turning against them. From the steep slopes of the volcanic hills surrounding the bay, the islanders began to rain down stones. Thousands of projectiles, ranging from small river pebbles to heavy, jagged volcanic boulders, arched through the humid air. They plummeted into the boats, striking the wood with a dull, sickening thud and tearing into the flesh of the men. It was a relentless, punishing bombardment. The French sailors, caught in the open, were completely defenseless against this airborne onslaught. They cowered in the bottom of the boats, their hands instinctively shielding their heads, as the stones tore through their clothing and crushed their limbs. De Langley, even while under fire, remained trapped within the rigid, compassionate constraints of his own philosophy. He looked at the chaos unfolding, the screaming men, the bloody water, and the wall of humanity closing in. He had the power to end the immediate threat. His men carried flintlock muskets, heavy-bore weapons capable of devastating, lethal impact at close range. A single, disciplined volley into the massed crowd on the shore would have undoubtedly broken the momentum of the attack, forced the islanders to scatter, and potentially granted the French the window of time needed to dislodge their boats. But de Langley recoiled from this option. He was not a man of war, but a man of the Enlightenment. He carried a heavy burden of moral responsibility toward his king, his country, and his own conscience. He possessed a profound, almost paralyzing fear that if he ordered his men to open fire, he would be branded a butcher upon his return to Europe. He believed that the violence was a temporary misunderstanding, a volatile eruption that could still be contained through restraint and an appeal to human reason. He raised his voice over the thunderous roar of the crowd and ordered his men to fire their muskets into the air. He wanted to use the sound, the sharp, piercing crack of gunpowder, as a deterrent, a psychological barrier of noise rather than a literal barrier of lead. It was a tactical, humanitarian decision, and it was a fatal error. The sound of the muskets rang out, echoing off the towering volcanic walls of the bay. The islanders paused, a collective intake of breath ripples through the crowd. For a heartbeat, the rain of stones ceased. But then, as the smoke cleared and they realized that no one had fallen, that the magic of the foreigners' weapons was merely noise, their hesitation vanished. They perceived the restraint not as an act of mercy, but as an admission of weakness. Their fear evaporated, replaced by emboldened, savage clarity. The crowd surged forward, a tidal wave of humanity crashing into the shallow water, closing the final distance to the stranded boats. The standoff had ended. The slaughter was about to begin. The relative safety of the boats was obliterated in seconds. The islanders swarmed the sides, their hands grasping the gunwales, pulling and tipping the boats. The French sailors, exhausted and terrified, were dragged from their vessels into the surf. The water, so clear and inviting only an hour before, became a swirling, blood-filled arena of primal violence. De Langley, standing in the stern of the lead boat, was a primary target. He was the figure of authority, the man who had brought them here, the man who had failed to protect them. A massive, jagged volcanic stone struck him square in the temple with the force of a falling anvil. The impact was sickening, audible even above the chaos. He slumped, his eyes rolling back, before he was knocked from the boat into the dark, swirling water. He never rose again. He was immediately set upon by the surging tide of attackers, his body subjected to a frenzied, brutal assault by clubs, wooden staves, and curved obsidian blades. The man who had been the very heart of the mission, the commander who had valued every life under his command, was silenced in the very place he had chosen to save them. Beside him, the tragedy claimed the lives of the finest minds of the French Academy. Robert de Laumanon, the physicist who had spent his life seeking the underlying laws of the universe, found his own existence abruptly and violently terminated on that white, sun-drenched beach. He was dragged into the surf, his scientific instruments trampled underfoot in the mud, as he was struck down by the very people he had come to document and understand. Father Louis Receveur, the chaplain who sought the divine in the world, fell alongside the sailors he had comforted only hours before, his skull fractured by the relentless rain of stone and wood. It was a chaotic, uncoordinated massacre. There was no battle line, no tactical retreat, no formation to hold. It was a scene of utter, horrific fragmentation, where 61 individuals fought for their lives against an ocean of fury. The remaining sailors, seeing their leaders fall and realizing that no salvation would come from the shore, turned their attention to the only possibility of survival. They fought their way out of the crush of the crowd, their movements desperate, erratic, and fueled by pure adrenaline. They threw themselves into the deepening water, struggling to reach the 2 remaining cutter boats that were still anchored slightly further out, just beyond the reach of the most intense press of the attackers. They swam, they waded, they crawled over the sharp, unforgiving coral that tore their flesh and shredded their clothing. Every movement was a battle against the elements and the relentless, pursuing islanders who waded into the waist-deep water with clubs and spears, looking to finish what had begun on the beach. The air was filled with the sounds of agony, the splashing of water, and the cries of men who knew they were witnessing the end of their lives. The 2 cutters, manned by the men who had managed to retain their positions, began a desperate, sustained fire. This time, there was no hesitation. The restraint that had cost de Langley his life was abandoned. The sailors fired directly into the water, into the swarming mass of outrigger canoes and the figures wading toward them. The reports of the muskets were no longer warnings. They were the desperate, final protest of men who were watching their world vanish beneath the waves. The water became a chaotic mess of smoke, spray, and blood as the fire forced the pursuing islanders to break off their attack. The remaining French survivors scrambled into the boats, their bodies covered in bruises, lacerations, and the salt of the sea, their eyes wide with the hollow, terrifying emptiness of men who had seen the abyss. As they pushed away from the coral shelf, leaving behind the bodies of their commander, their chaplain, their lead scientist, and their brothers-in-arms, they looked back at the shore one last time. Asu Bay, once the dream of a peaceful discovery, was now the site of a profound, permanent silence. The mission had ended, not with the triumph of reason, but with the brutal, uncompromising reality of human conflict. The survivors turned their boats toward the horizon, where the massive, silent silhouettes of the Boussole and the L'Astrolabe waited, unaware that they were now the only remaining remnants of a shattered, broken dream. The silence that descended upon the Boussole and the L'Astrolabe as the few survivors scrambled aboard was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating quiet of a wake. The 2 frigates, which had spent years as proud, towering symbols of French scientific progress and Enlightenment ideals, now sat motionless on the water, transformed into floating mausoleums. The scene on the decks was one of visceral, unvarnished horror. The returning sailors were not merely exhausted. They were broken, their bodies mapped with the jagged lacerations of the coral reef and the deep, dark purple contusions from the stone bombardment. They climbed over the gunwales in a daze, their uniforms hanging in shredded rags, their faces masks of salt, grime, and trauma. As they collapsed onto the wooden planks, the sheer magnitude of the disaster began to settle over the ships like a funeral shroud. The roll call was a ritual of mounting despair. 12 men had been left behind on that beach, among them the expedition's most trusted voices, Captain Paul-Antoine Fleuriot de Langley, the man whose empathy had been his undoing, Robert de Laumanon, the mind whose quest for understanding had been silenced in the surf, and Father Louis Receveur, whose spiritual guidance had been extinguished in the chaos. Commodore Leperouse stood upon the quarterdeck of the Boussole, his eyes fixed on the distant, silent mouth of Asu Bay. The man who had navigated the globe with cold, unwavering precision now faced an inner storm that threatened to undo him. The psychological burden of the decision, the compromise he had made against his own tactical judgment, weighed upon him with an intensity that transcended his professional duty. Every detail of that fateful, blood-drenched afternoon was being reconstructed in the minds of the survivors. The deck was a confessional. Men spoke in hushed, trembling tones of the sheer wall of humanity that had risen to meet them, of the rain of stone that had felt like an atmospheric collapse, and of the agonizing moments when they realized that the reason they had so carefully cultivated was utterly powerless against the primal, defensive rage of the islanders. The survivors recounted the moment the boats were swamped, the crushing weight of the water and the wood, and the vivid, traumatic memory of watching their leaders being pulled beneath the surface. It was a forensic reconstruction of failure, a step-by-step analysis of how a mission of peace had curdled into a scene of such singular, unredeemable violence. The immediate aftermath on the frigates was characterized by a frantic, high-tension atmosphere of self-preservation and tactical survival. The ships were still anchored in a volatile environment, surrounded by the unknown. The remaining crew, now profoundly diminished, rushed to secure the decks. They loaded the cannons, cleaned the muskets with trembling hands, and set a vigilant watch that turned every ripple on the surface of the water into a potential threat. Yet, this military vigilance was layered with a pervasive, deep-seated emotional fracture. The ship's logs, usually filled with the meticulous, dry observations of geography and weather, now recorded the raw, unfiltered agony of loss. They were not just soldiers or sailors anymore. They were the grieving survivors of a massacre. The ship's surgeons worked through the night, the dim glow of lanterns casting long, distorted shadows across the decks as they performed the grim tasks of cleaning wounds, stitching lacerations, and attempting to stabilize the 20 men who had been severely injured in the retreat. The moans of the wounded were the only soundtrack to the long, hollow hours of the night. The following morning, the reality of their position hit with the cold clarity of dawn. The islanders were nowhere to be seen, yet the ships felt as if they were being watched from the dense, impenetrable green of the jungle. The crew of the Bussel and the Lasterlabe, driven by a raw, visceral thirst for vengeance, swarmed the decks with a collective, jagged fury. They had witnessed the slaughter of their friends. They had seen the brutality of the islanders. Now, they looked to Leperouse for the order to strike back. The mood was electric, a volatile cocktail of grief and rage that demanded a cathartic release. The men begged the Commodore to turn the massive, bronze-mouthed cannons toward the village of Asu. They wanted to shell the hills, to reduce the settlement to charcoal and ash, to hold the island accountable for the blood that stained the bay. It was a request born of the most basic, human instinct for retribution. An eye for an eye, a village for a lost commander. Leperouse stood at the rail, his face etched with a decade of aging in a single night. He listened to the pleas, the shouts of the men who felt that anything less than total destruction was a betrayal of the dead. But as he looked across the distance to the beach, he saw not a target, but a society, a complex, vibrant world that they had barely begun to understand. He realized that to engage in a punitive bombardment would be to abandon the very soul of their mission. To kill indiscriminately, to burn the homes of those who were not involved, to turn the ships into engines of indiscriminate slaughter would be to negate everything they had stood for since leaving France. He chose, in that moment, the most difficult path of all, the path of restraint. He would not turn his ships into executioners. He would not allow the grief of the moment to dictate the legacy of the voyage. He ordered a single, massive cannon to be fired into the open water, a sound of such singular power that it thundered across the bay, sending a plume of spray 100 feet into the air. It was a demonstration of force, a declaration of their power to destroy, but it was not a weapon of slaughter. It was a statement that the French were leaving, that the violence had concluded, and that they would not be drawn into the trap of repeating the very savagery they had witnessed. The decision to sail away, to turn the bows of the frigates toward the open Pacific while leaving the bodies of their comrades behind in the sands of Asa Bay, was the most profound act of moral courage in the entire history of the expedition. As the anchors were weighed and the massive white sails began to fill with the trade winds, a heavy, resonant silence settled over the entire fleet. The ships moved slowly, almost reluctantly, away from the island. The men lined the rails, their heads bowed, looking back at the shore that now held the heart of their expedition. It was a funeral procession on the water, a departure characterized by the agonizing realization that they could not retrieve their dead, that they could not offer them the rights of the sea or the soil of their homeland. They were abandoning their brothers to a place that would never remember their names with the same reverence the French held for them. This departure was not merely a physical retreat. It was an admission of a fundamental, tragic truth. The Enlightenment vision of an interconnected, peaceful world had hit an immovable wall. The expedition had set out to document, to trade, and to share the light of reason. Instead, they had encountered the raw, uncompromising boundaries of culture and survival. The massacre of Asu Bay became, for Leperouse and his remaining men, the final, permanent punctuation mark on their journey. The optimism, the youthful vigor, and the grand, idealized objectives they had carried from Versailles were gone, buried on a beach in the middle of the Pacific. What remained was a diminished, somber, and deeply haunted crew, sailing toward an uncertain future. They had learned the most expensive lesson a traveler can know, that some frontiers are not meant to be bridged, and that sometimes the cost of discovery is the loss of one's own humanity. As the island of Tutuila faded into a smudge of blue on the horizon, the survivors turned their gaze forward, toward the vast, empty expanse of the sea, carrying with them the silence of the dead and the crushing weight of a tragedy that would never be fully understood, nor ever truly left behind. They were no longer explorers in the sense they had understood when they departed. They were survivors of a collapse, navigating through the aftermath of a reality that had proven to be far more dangerous and far more complex than any map had ever suggested. The immediate aftermath of the massacre did not offer the luxury of a slow, mournful process of legal reckoning. There were no courtrooms in the middle of the Pacific, no impartial juries to weigh the evidence of stone and spear against the authority of naval command. Instead, the judgment of the tragedy was rendered in the cold, unyielding silence of the sea as the two frigates, the Boussole and the L'Astrolabe, retreated into the horizon. For the surviving crew, the trial was a solitary, internal process, a desperate attempt to reconcile their training, their orders, and their lived experience with the chaos they had witnessed. Commodore Leperouse, bearing the crushing weight of supreme command, became the sole judge and executor of the mission's fractured legacy. He did not convene a formal inquiry, for there was no one left to provide an objective testimony. The primary witnesses, the ones who had held the pulse of the mission and the depth of its moral compass, were silent in the sands of Asu. Leperouse was left to interrogate the survivors, to piece together the disjointed, traumatized accounts of the men who had escaped the surf, and to evaluate his own catastrophic failure to perceive the lethal shift in the tide and the crowd's disposition. The investigation, if it could be called that, was a process of rapid, agonizing reconstruction. The ship's officers sat in the cramped, lantern-lit cabins, comparing the accounts of the men who had rowed the cutters and the survivors who had been dragged back aboard, their bodies raw and bruised. They examined the remnants of the equipment, the broken rudders, the shredded canvas of the boats, and the missing muskets that had been lost to the waves. Every detail was scrutinized with the desperate hope of finding a logic behind the violence. They looked for the spark, the specific moment when curiosity had mutated into carnage. Was it the injury of the woman? Was it the frustration over the stalled boats on the reef? Or was it, as some of the hardened sailors argued, an inevitable consequence of lingering too long in a place where they were fundamentally, undeniably out of place? The officers documented these accounts in their journals, the ink often smudged by the dampness of the sea and the trembling of their hands. These journals became the only legal record of the event, the only testimony that would ever reach the distant courts of France. However, the verdict of this investigation was never written in a ledger of laws. It was written in the quiet, somber demeanor of the fleet as it pressed forward toward Australia. There was no formal disciplinary action taken against the men who had fired, for to punish them would have been to punish the instinct for survival. There was no censure of the deceased, for to condemn the fallen would have been an affront to the men who had been the heart of the mission. The reality of their situation superseded any bureaucratic formality. They were a shattered, diminished collective, tasked with the impossible burden of completing a mission that had been fundamentally hollowed out by the loss of its intellectual and moral leadership. The sentencing was the ongoing, grueling labor of managing a crippled expedition. The crew had to maintain the masts, monitor the water stores, and chart the remainder of their path, while every waking hour was haunted by the absence of their comrades. When the news of the tragedy finally filtered back to the civilized world, the trial moved from the decks of the frigates to the grand halls of European academic and naval institutions. Yet, even there, the adjudication was clouded by the immense distance and the tragic mystery of the expedition's ultimate fate, for the mission would go on to vanish entirely in the South Pacific, leaving the massacre at Asu as the last known, verified account of their journey. The narrative that emerged in the salons of Paris was not one of legal culpability, but of romanticized, tragic martyrdom. Scholars and naval historians analyzed the logs with a detached, analytical lens, arguing over the tactical errors of the landing and the cultural misunderstandings that had sparked the clash. They debated whether de Langley had been negligent in his trust, whether Leperouse had been too lenient in his command, and whether the inherent nature of the indigenous population was one of inherent hostility or reflexive, defensive violence. These debates, stripped of the raw, visceral trauma of the survivors, transformed a bloody, chaotic massacre into a theoretical case study for the age of discovery. The verdict of history, however, was far more nuanced and unforgiving. It did not hold the individual sailors responsible, nor did it simply blame the victims for their failure to predict the uncontrollable. Instead, the judgment of history landed squarely on the fundamental, structural flaw of the Enlightenment project itself, the belief that the world could be mapped, understood, and integrated into the European framework without the inevitable and often lethal friction of local realities. The massacre became a permanent, chilling symbol of the limitations of reason. It served as a stark, indelible reminder that the map is never the territory, and that the noble intentions of the scholar and the diplomat are frequently overwhelmed by the primal, localized imperatives of survival. The legal and moral investigation of the Asa massacre was ultimately a testament to the inability of the European mind to fully reconcile the destruction of their peers with the mission they had been sent to achieve. They sought a culprit, they sought a logical sequence of events, and they sought a justification for the bloodshed. But in the end, they found only the cold, unanswerable silence of the beach. Years later, when the French government finally sought to memorialize the event, they did so not with a proclamation of victory or a condemnation of the enemy, but with a simple, enduring monument of stone and metal. The 1883 construction of the monument at Asu was, in itself, an act of final adjudication, a recognition that the dead belonged to history and that their sacrifice required not retribution, but remembrance. By placing the monument in the exact spot where the bodies were thought to have fallen, the government was essentially closing the case. It was a formal, public acknowledgement that the tragedy had occurred, that the individuals involved were worthy of memory, and that the violence was a settled chapter of the colonial and exploratory past. The monument effectively transformed the crime scene into a site of reflection, sanitizing the raw, horrific details of the slaughter into a narrative of historical occurrence. The trial of the Asa massacre never ended in a gavel strike or a public execution. It ended in the quiet encroachment of nature upon the site of the violence and the steady, patient work of the local villagers who continued to live, fish, and work in the shadow of the bay. They did not inherit the guilt of their ancestors, nor did they treat the site as a place of shame. Instead, they acted as the custodians of the history, protecting the monument and ensuring that the story of the strangers who had come to their shores remained anchored to the land. In this way, the judgment of the Asa tragedy was passed from the hands of the naval commanders and the distant bureaucrats to the hands of those who remained. The ultimate verdict was that life would continue, that the sea would eventually wash away the blood, and that the horrific details of the massacre would become a part of the local lore, a story to be told to the next generation, not as an indictment, but as a bridge, a painful, scar tissue connection between the world that arrived in wooden ships and the world that had been there since the beginning. The investigative process of the massacre, which began with the frantic, panicked shouts of survivors on the decks of the Bussol, concluded centuries later as a quiet, respectful presence in the daily lives of the people of Tutuila, a permanent, mute witness to the day the Enlightenment met the infinite complexity of the human experience. The tragedy at Asa Bay, an event that etched itself into the annals of oceanic exploration with the permanence of stone, remains a somber mirror reflecting the inherent vulnerabilities of human ambition. Looking back at the events of December 1787, one cannot help but be struck by the profound duality of the expedition. It was a journey conceived in the lofty, luminous halls of Versailles, driven by the most advanced scientific and philosophical aspirations of the 18th century, yet it ended in a shallow, blood-stained cove on a remote Pacific island, governed by the most primal and unforgiving laws of survival. The aftermath and the historical legacy of the massacre serve as a haunting meditation on the fragility of reason when it is displaced from its accustomed environment and thrust into the chaotic, unmapped realities of the wider world. The ships, the Bussol and the L'Astrolabe, were essentially floating vessels of Enlightenment thought, carrying the best minds and the most hopeful ideals of their time. They were tasked with the noble mission of connecting the distant corners of the earth, of documenting the diversity of human existence, and of expanding the parameters of geographic and scientific understanding. Yet, the tragedy at Tutuila fundamentally fractured that mission, turning an endeavor meant to illuminate the unknown into a stark illustration of how quickly and violently that light can be extinguished. The long-term consequences of this massacre rippled through the history of European navigation for decades. For nearly 40 years, the mere mention of the Samoan archipelago was sufficient to instill a cold, paralyzing terror in the hearts of mariners. The islands, which had appeared on the horizon as idyllic, welcoming emerald gems, were rebranded in the collective consciousness of the maritime world as a place of dark, unpredictable danger. This isolation, born from fear, arguably accelerated the very cycle of misunderstanding and conflict that the expedition had sought to avoid. By avoiding the shores of Samoa, European vessels remained ignorant of the evolving social structures, the resilience, and the deeply rooted cultural traditions of the indigenous populations. The savage label, applied reflexively by those who heard the survivors' tales, served as a psychological shield, protecting the European ego from the uncomfortable truth that the massacre was not a result of inherent barbarism, but a catastrophic failure of diplomacy, patience, and mutual perception. The long shadow of Asu Bay discouraged genuine engagement, ensuring that when the mission of connection finally resumed in the 1830s with the arrival of Christian missionaries, it was predicated on an entirely different set of power dynamics, leaving the original spirit of mutual scientific discovery buried in the past. Reflecting upon the massacre from the vantage point of the 21st century, it is impossible to ignore the profound, quiet dignity of the site itself. The 1883 monument, with its weathered bronze plaque and its resolute stone cross, stands as an enduring testament to the complexity of historical memory. It does not speak in the strident tones of colonial triumph, nor does it wail in the voice of a victim. It exists as a neutral anchor in the landscape, a mute observer that has weathered the salt air, the tropical storms, and the relentless march of time. The fact that the local community of Asu has taken upon itself the duty of caring for the site, clearing the brush, polishing the bronze, and keeping the path accessible, is perhaps the most poignant resolution to the entire affair. It is an act of profound cultural grace. It signifies that the people of Tutuila have integrated this history, however painful, into their own identity. They do not hold the dead of the Bussol as enemies, nor do they look upon the monument as a symbol of historical grievance. They have claimed the narrative, ensuring that the men who died there are remembered not just for how they perished, but for the fact that their lives, and the tragic circumstances of their end, have become a permanent, unseverable part of the island's own unfolding story. The massacre at Asu Bay stands as a definitive, tragic inflection point in the story of globalization. It is a story of what happens when two worlds, operating on entirely different timelines, philosophies, and environmental imperatives, collide with catastrophic force. The French explorers carried with them the heavy burden of a grand, rationalized map of the world, a world that they believed was waiting to be categorized and integrated. The Samoans, in turn, were reacting to a sudden, incomprehensible incursion into their sovereign, carefully balanced reality. They were not merely reacting to the presence of strangers. They were reacting to the disruption of their social stability, the depletion of their resources, and the sudden, overwhelming influx of alien technology and behavior. The tragedy of the event lies in the fact that, at the critical moment of potential connection, both sides were blinded by their own, localized truths. The French were blinded by their humanitarian mission and their medical desperation. The Samoans were blinded by the necessity of preserving their order against an unmanageable, encroaching force. There is an unavoidable, haunting poignancy in the fate of Commodore Lapérouse and his crew. They were the harbingers of a new era, men who truly believed that they were sailing toward a future defined by dialogue and knowledge, that they instead sailed toward a complete, absolute oblivion. Their expedition eventually vanishing entirely in the South Pacific, leaving only the massacre at Asu as the final recorded chapter of their voyage, lends the tragedy a mythic, timeless quality. They are the ghosts of the Enlightenment, forever anchored to the beach at Tutuila, serving as a reminder that the pursuit of progress is rarely a straight line. It is a path fraught with moral pitfalls, miscalculations, and the ever-present potential for the very ideals we hold most dear to collapse under the pressure of human fallibility. The survivors who returned to the frigates, those hollow-eyed men who looked back at the shore one last time as the ships caught the trade winds, were the carriers of a truth that the world was not yet ready to hear. That exploration is a mirror, and sometimes the reflection is too difficult to bear. In the end, the memory of Asu Bay is not defined by the violence of the incident, but by the stillness that follows it. It is a story that demands a certain humility from those of us who study history. It asks us to look beyond the binary of victor and victim, beyond the simplistic narratives of heroes and villains, and instead to acknowledge the profound, common tragedy of the human condition. We are all, in our way, explorers navigating the shifting tides of our own circumstances. We all carry with us the weight of our intentions, and we all, eventually, encounter the jagged coral reefs of a reality we did not anticipate. The tragedy of the French expedition is not that they failed to map the Pacific. It is that they, like all of us, ultimately had to reckon with the limits of their own understanding. The monument at Asu remains, a quiet sentinel on a beautiful, dangerous beach, reminding every visitor that history is not just a sequence of dates and battles, but a layered, living conversation between the past and the present, a dialogue that requires us to listen with the same depth, empathy, and complexity as the lives it seeks to commemorate. The waters of the bay continue to rise and fall with the moon, indifferent to the names and the stories of those who once stood upon its shore, yet the story endures, held in the careful hands of those who remain, a testament to the fact that even the darkest chapters of the human story can eventually be transformed into a bridge across the divides of time and culture. As we reflect on the voyage of the Boussole and the L'astrolabe, we are left with the echoing question of what might have been, a question that finds its only answer in the steady, rhythmic wash of the Pacific surf against the sand, a cycle of renewal that persists, long after the last muskets have fired and the last ships have sailed into the dark. The narrative of the Asu massacre is not merely a record of an 18th-century disaster. It is a profound, echoing case study in the anatomy of cultural trauma and the long, arduous road to reconciliation. To truly understand the resonance of this event, one must look beyond the immediate shock of the bloodletting on the beach and consider the slow, generational process of integration that has followed. For the people of American Samoa, the monument that stands today is not simply a historical marker. It is a silent, enduring participant in the island's social fabric. It represents a pivot point between the pre-colonial era of the Pacific and the complex, globalized reality of the modern territory. The site has been transformed from a theater of death into a space of quiet, reflective stability. This transformation is, in itself, a feat of collective psychology, an achievement that speaks to the strength of the community in absorbing a historical wound and refusing to let it define their future through bitterness or cycles of retribution. When we contemplate the survivors who sailed away from the coast of Tutuila, we see men carrying a heavy, invisible cargo. They were not merely returning to their ships. They were returning to a world that was rapidly changing, one that would soon demand their narratives of discovery to justify further expansion. Yet, the survivors of the Busol and the Lasterlabe had lived a reality that defied the neat, heroic structures of European imperial storytelling. They had seen the limits of their own power. They had felt the primal pulse of an indigenous resistance that was entirely rational within its own context. This psychological tension, the gap between the triumphant, imperialist view of exploration and the grounded, terrifying reality of the massacre, is the true, lasting legacy of the voyage. The story of Asu became a haunting, subterranean current in the history of French maritime exploration, a cautionary tale that was whispered in the corridors of the naval academies, serving as a reminder that the ocean, and the peoples who dwelled within its expansive embrace, were not passive subjects to be documented, but active participants with their own agency, their own histories, and their own imperative to protect their shores from the encroaching, uninvited unknown. The persistent, almost obsessive documentation of the event by subsequent historians, from the 19th century diarists who pored over the ship's logs to the contemporary scholars who mapped the shifting sands and archaeological records of the bay, illustrates a deep, collective need to understand. We are a species driven by a need for resolution, a species that cannot bear the idea of a story left dangling in the void. We seek to impose logic upon the erratic, bloody impulses of the past, hoping that by organizing the facts of the Asu tragedy into a coherent sequence, the debate over water, the retreating tide, the injury of the woman, the rain of stones, and the final, frantic retreat, we might somehow shield ourselves from the unpredictability of our own existence. But the story of the massacre refuses to be fully tamed by such analysis. It remains, stubbornly, a story of fragments, broken boats, lost muskets, the faded ink of journals that would never see the light of day, and the silence of the coral reef that claimed the men who sought to cross the boundaries of their time. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this tragedy is the way it underscores the inherent, tragic distance between the intent of the individual and the consequence of the group. Captain de Langley, in his final, fatal hour, was operating from a space of profound personal integrity. He was a man striving to be the best version of an Enlightenment commander, someone who could be both efficient in his mission and compassionate in his leadership. That his compassion was the very thing that led him into the arms of a violent and is not a sign of his failure. It is a sign of the brutal, indifferent reality of the stage upon which he stood. The massacre at Asu Bay forces us to confront the possibility that integrity does not always produce success, and that the noblest of intentions can, under the right conditions of stress, geography, and cultural collision, precipitate the most horrific of outcomes. It is a lesson that strips away the vanity of our modern, interconnected self-image and reminds us that we are all, ultimately, vulnerable to the shifting tides of our circumstances. Looking at the world today, the site at Tutuila is a place of profound stillness, where the roar of the Pacific and the rustle of the tropical canopy create a rhythmic, meditative environment that seems entirely removed from the violence of the past. The presence of the monument, integrated into the life of the village, is a silent negotiation with history. It is a way of saying, we remember what happened here, we acknowledge the loss, and we choose to move forward. This is the ultimate, and perhaps only, justice available for a tragedy of this magnitude. Justice here is not found in the courtroom, nor in the act of vengeance, but in the refusal to let the tragedy sever the continuity of the community. The village of Asu has not turned its back on the site. It has embraced it, ensuring that the strangers who died on their beach are remembered as part of the total, complex history of the island. This is the most profound possible memorial, one that prioritizes the continuity of human life over the preservation of historical grievances. The voyage of the Boussole and the L'Astrolabe remains one of the great, unfinished stories of the maritime age. They were meant to be the agents of a new, enlightened order, but they were instead swallowed by the vast, uncontainable forces of the world they sought to map. Their disappearance in the South Pacific, preceded by the violent rupturing of their mission at Asu, leaves us with a lingering, philosophical question. What are we truly seeking when we set out to explore the unknown? Are we seeking knowledge, or are we seeking to confirm our own superiority? Are we seeking connection, or are we seeking to impose our own order upon the world? The massacre at Asu Bay offers no simple answer to these questions, but it asks them with an intensity that cannot be ignored. It serves as a permanent, cautionary beacon, illuminating the jagged rocks of human fallibility that lie beneath the surface of all our grand, universal ambitions. As the story of Asu Bay continues to be passed down, from the written logs of the naval officers to the oral histories of the islanders, and now into the global, digital consciousness of the modern age, it evolves into something more than a tragedy of the past. It becomes a reflection of the present. It reminds us that every act of cross-cultural encounter is an act of extreme risk, one that requires not just the curiosity of the scholar and the strength of the commander, but the profound, humble patience of the listener. The monument on the beach remains, a piece of forged metal and carved stone held in the grasp of the earth, watching as the centuries pass and as the nature of human exploration changes from the wooden hull and the canvas sail to the satellite and the probe. Yet, the essential, terrifying vulnerability of the human heart remains unchanged. We are still, at our core, the same explorers who stood on the deck of the Boussole, looking toward an island we did not understand, hoping for a cup of water, and finding instead the limits of our own existence. The legacy of the Asu massacre is not the death that occurred there, but the persistent, enduring reminder that we must walk softly upon this earth, mindful of the histories that precede us, the boundaries that define us, and the immense, humbling vastness of the world that we have yet to truly, deeply understand. In the silence of the bay, the story settles into the sand, a foundational truth for any who choose to listen, reminding us that while we may map the world, we can never fully account for the secrets that lie within the hearts of those we meet, or the unpredictable, unyielding beauty of the world itself. The voyage is never truly over. It continues within us as we sail into the future, always searching, always risking, and always learning the cost of what it means to truly, honestly encounter one another. The enduring resonance of the Asu massacre serves as an eternal anchor for our modern reflections on discovery and the inherent fragility of the human experience. As we reach the final movement of this somber exploration, we find ourselves standing once more upon the white, sun-drenched sands of that fateful Tutuila Cove, looking out across the expanse of the Pacific. The passage of centuries has done little to diminish the gravity of the events that occurred there in 1787. Rather, it has served to distill the incident into its most essential, haunting elements: the collision of intent and reality, the vulnerability of the explorer, and the unforgiving, beautiful autonomy of the land itself. We must recognize that the story of the Asu massacre is not a closed chapter of history, but a recurring theme in the narrative of our species, a narrative defined by our desperate, unending reach toward the horizon and our recurring inability to anticipate the consequences of our arrivals. The monument standing on the beach is not merely a record of a specific, violent encounter. It is a monument to the very act of reaching out. It acknowledges that there is an inherent risk in the desire to know, to see, and to connect, and that this risk, while sometimes resulting in the most profound of tragedies, is also the engine of our human progress. When we consider the ultimate fate of the expedition, the loss of Commodore Lapierre and his entire fleet in the mysterious, uncharted vastness of the South Pacific, the massacre at Asu takes on a new, more profound significance. It becomes the final bridge between the known world of European enlightenment and the total, absolute abyss. The survivors who witnessed the slaughter on the beach were, in a very real sense, the last bearers of the mission's original purpose. By the time the ships disappeared from all maps, the massacre had already begun to serve as the definition of their legacy. It was the moment the world began to close its doors to them, the moment the illusion of a seamless, peaceful expansion was shattered by the sharp, undeniable truth of local sovereignty. The tragedy at Asu is the point at which the Enlightenment met its match in the complex, unyielding reality of the Pacific, a reality that did not exist to be discovered, but existed in its own right, complete and fully formed long before the first European mast appeared on the horizon. This realization, while humbling, is essential for any honest reckoning with history. It demands that we step away from the colonial-era perspective that viewed the world as a blank canvas and instead see it as a vibrant, interconnected web of lives, traditions, and priorities that were and are as valid as any we have constructed in our own centers of power. The silence that persists today in Asu Bay is a testament to the power of time to absorb the most violent of impacts. Nature, in its persistent, rhythmic cycle of growth and erosion, has claimed the site, weaving it into the tapestry of the island's existence. The volcanic hills still rise with the same silent majesty. The stream continues to pour its fresh, sweet life-giving water down to the sea. The reef remains, a jagged, defensive guardian of the shoreline. The site has been returned to its original purpose, a place of life and subsistence, and in doing so, it has stripped away the myth of the massacre's exclusivity. It is no longer just a place of death. It is a place of enduring, simple existence. This is a profound, quiet victory of life over the memory of the conflict. By choosing to incorporate the monument into their own lives, the people of Tutuila have demonstrated a resilience that surpasses the reach of any historical account. They have transformed the site from a symbol of a ruptured past into a component of an ongoing, living community. This evolution is the ultimate vindication of the human spirit's capacity to heal, to integrate, and to persist, even in the shadow of the most profound, unexplained losses. In contemplating the deeper, philosophical implications of the massacre, we are confronted with the reality that our understanding of history is always filtered through the limitations of our own perspectives. The logs of the French naval officers, while meticulous in their documentation of the event, are inherently limited by the cultural blinders of their time. They describe the violence as a tragedy of savagery because they lack the cognitive and cultural tools to describe it as an act of defensive territorial preservation. This is not to condemn them, but to recognize the structural, unavoidable limitations of the human mind when confronted with the profoundly foreign. Our modern efforts to understand the event, to document the archaeological remains, to analyze the sociological conditions, and to retell the story through the voices of the past, are themselves filtered through the lens of our current, contemporary values. We are always, in every sense, interpreting the past to suit the needs of our present, using the lessons of the massacre to build the frameworks of our own, hopefully more empathetic, world. The ongoing interest in the story is a reflection of our collective hope that we might one day learn to navigate these collisions with greater grace, greater wisdom, and a more profound recognition of our shared, fragile vulnerability. As the years continue to turn, and as the technological means by which we interact with the world continue to evolve, the essential challenge of the encounter remains constant. Whether we are arriving in wooden frigates or observing the world through the digital lenses of the 21st century, the encounter between the self and the other is always a moment of extreme, volatile potential. The massacre at Asu Bay stands as a permanent, cautionary reminder that there is no shortcut to understanding, no substitute for patience, and no guarantee of peace in the pursuit of knowledge. It is a story that requires us to walk into the world with a sense of humility, to be prepared for the fact that our perceptions are always incomplete, and to acknowledge that every shore we reach is a home to someone else's history, someone else's truth, and someone else's imperative for survival. The monument remains a silent, humble witness, watching as we continue to sail, continue to search, and continue to struggle toward a future that we hope will be worthy of the lessons we have been forced, at such a high cost, to learn. In the quiet, Rhythmic wash of the Pacific, the story of Asu Bay finds its home, anchored to the bedrock of Tutuila and carried by the memories of those who recognize its significance. It is a tragedy that has become a foundation, a loss that has become a lesson, and a collision that has become a conversation. We are left with the echoing, profound understanding that while the ships are long gone and the names of the dead are weathered into illegibility on the bronze, the human impulse to reach out, to understand, and to face the unknown with courage is what ultimately defines our journey. The voyage may lead us into dark, uncharted waters. It may demand of us more than we are prepared to give, and it may, at times, leave us standing on a beach of shattered dreams. Yet, it is the only journey we have. We sail forward, mindful of the ghosts that drift beneath the keel, grateful for the waters that carry us, and ever watchful for the next horizon. We are the inheritors of the stories that came before, the stewards of the memories that define us, and the travelers who must, in the end, find our own way toward a shore that, if we are humble enough, we might finally come to understand as a place of shared, enduring humanity. The silence of the bay holds this final truth, that in the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving theater of our world, the most important discovery we will ever make is the realization that we are all, in our own fragile ways, searching for the same sweet water of understanding, and that we are all, always, sailing together toward the same uncertain and infinitely unfolding dawn. The final reflection on the massacre at Asu Bay brings us to a profound understanding of how we assign meaning to the silence that follows the storm. For nearly 2.5 centuries, the story of this bloody encounter has been meticulously reconstructed by historians, memorialized by stone, and whispered through the generations of those living in the shadow of the volcanic peaks of Tutuila. Yet, despite our relentless efforts to categorize, analyze, and justify the events of that December afternoon in 1787, there remains an unyielding core of mystery, an essential, untamable quality of the event that defies our need for total comprehension. This mystery is not a failure of our research or a deficiency in our archival capabilities. It is, rather, the inherent nature of history itself when it is forced to confront the absolute and final silence of those who are no longer present to speak for themselves. The loss of the Busol and the Lastralabe in the broader, unknown reaches of the Pacific only compounds this sense of incomplete narrative, casting the Asa massacre as the definitive, tragic prologue to a larger, vanished story. We are forced to conclude that the massacre is a manifestation of the other, not in the sense of an inherent, irreconcilable difference between the European visitor and the Pacific inhabitant, but in the sense of the absolute, insurmountable distance between two distinct realities occupying the same space at the same moment. Each side was governed by its own internal logic, its own cultural imperatives, and its own definition of survival. To the French, the bay was a source of fresh water, a logistical necessity for the preservation of a grand scientific endeavor. To the Samoans, the bay was a territorial threshold, a vulnerable front that had been suddenly and overwhelmingly breached by an unpredictable force that brought with it the dual promise of trade and the potential for destabilizing disruption. These two realities did not simply touch, they overlapped and, in the volatile crucible of a receding tide and a dense, restless crowd, they ignited. The violence that followed was the result of a catastrophic misalignment, a failure of signals that occurred in the seconds before anyone could comprehend that a peaceful outcome had become mathematically and perhaps even physically impossible. The legacy of the Asa Monument, standing amidst the greenery of the coastal landscape, is a testament to the fact that we do not have to fully comprehend a tragedy to honor the humanity that was lost within it. We do not require a perfect, moral clarity to recognize the profound, shared loss that such an event represents. The monument is a vessel for our collective grief, a focal point that allows us to bypass the contentious arguments of colonial politics and focus instead on the stark, undeniable reality of mortality. It reminds us that every individual who perished on that beach, whether they were a navigator of the Enlightenment or a guardian of the island, was a person with a life, a history, and a future that were abruptly and violently terminated. By acknowledging this, We strip away the abstraction of the expedition or the conflict and replace it with the weight of individual existence. This, perhaps, is the most profound lesson we can derive from the Asa tragedy, that our shared vulnerability is the only true, universal baseline of our existence. Furthermore, we must acknowledge that the ongoing care for the site by the local community of Asu is an act of historical synthesis that is far more powerful than any external intervention or scholarly assessment. By embracing the site, the local villagers have removed the stain of the massacre and replaced it with a narrative of stewardship. They have decided that the history of their bay does not belong to the violence that occurred there, but to the continuity of the people who have lived there since. This is a lesson in the maturation of memory, a way of moving past the paralysis of victimhood or the defensive stance of denial. It is a path toward a holistic, mature engagement with the past, an engagement that allows for the coexistence of pain and life, sorrow and survival. The monument is no longer an indictment. It is a feature of the landscape, a piece of stone that has learned to live in harmony with the trees and the surf. As we look toward the future of how we approach such historical ruptures, the story of Asu offers a template for a more humble, nuanced way of engaging with our past. It suggests that our role as historians, storytellers, and stewards of memory is not to solve the tragedies of history as if they were equations, but to hold them in a space of respectful, ongoing dialogue. We must accept that some chapters will never be fully read, that some motivations will remain forever shielded by the passage of time, and that the ultimate truth of the encounter is less about what happened in the heat of the conflict and more about how we, the descendants of that conflict, choose to exist in the world we have inherited together. We must approach the past with the same humility that we should bring to our encounters with the unknown, a sense of wonder mixed with a profound, healthy caution. The final image of our long, meditative journey is the sight of the Pacific as it is today, vast, indifferent, and infinitely beautiful. The ocean does not remember the blood that was shed in the shallows of Tutuila. It only knows the rhythm of the tide, the movement of the currents, and the tireless, constant renewal of the life that dwells within it. We are the ones who remember. We are the ones who bear the burden of the stories, the ones who must decide what meaning we will extract from the chaos of our shared history. And as we stand on the beach, watching the waves roll in, we realize that the most important thing we can do is to continue the conversation, to keep the monument polished, to keep the story alive, and to keep ourselves open to the possibility that the next encounter, the next arrival, and the next moment of contact might be handled with more grace, more patience, and more understanding than the ones that came before. The voyage of our collective memory is a long one, marked by the light of discovery and the darkness of loss. We have learned, through the trial of the Asa massacre, that progress is not a steady march, but a series of fragile, precarious steps. We have learned that the maps we create are never complete, and that the most dangerous, yet potentially most transformative, spaces are those that exist between our understanding and our reality. We are the heirs to the ghosts of the Busol and the Lastralabe, the carriers of a history that is as complex and deep as the ocean itself. We carry this history not to dwell in the past, but to navigate the future with a more refined, sensitive awareness of the complexity of the human encounter. The story ends, as all great stories do, by returning us to the beginning, to the simple, profound fact of our presence in a world that is far larger, far older, and far more mysterious than we will ever be able to fully comprehend. We close this account not with a sense of closure, for history is never truly closed, but with a sense of continuity. The surf continues to beat against the shore of Asu, a steady, rhythmic, and reassuring presence that links the 18th century to the present moment. It is a sound that connects the fears of the past to the hopes of the future, a sound that persists long after our voices have faded. We leave the bay to its peace, trusting in the resilience of the landscape and the wisdom of the community that guards it. We leave the dead to their silence, knowing that they are no longer in need of our justification or our defense. We leave the story to the wind, to the waves, and to the endless, shifting sands of memory. And as we turn away from the beach, we do so with a renewed, deep-seated gratitude for the gift of this shared, interconnected, and fundamentally beautiful world, knowing that we are all, always, navigating the same vast, challenging, and infinitely promising sea together, searching for the light of understanding in the beautiful, complex shadows of our shared, and often painful, human journey. As the final echoes of the Asu Bay tragedy settle into the immutable record of history, we are left to contemplate the profound and enduring significance of such moments in the grand trajectory of human existence. The story we have traced, from the ambitious, Enlightenment-fueled departures at Versailles to the tragic, silent sands of a remote Tutuila Cove, is not merely a historical account of a failed mission or a violent encounter. It is a profound testament to the fragile nature of our interconnectedness. When we look back at the lives lost, the ships vanished, and the ideals shattered on that beach in 1787, we are compelled to recognize that every encounter between different worlds is an act of extreme courage, an act of vulnerability, and an act of profound, unavoidable risk. We must accept that the maps we create, both physical and ideological, are always incomplete, always subject to the unpredictable, unyielding pressures of reality, and that our greatest challenge as a species remains the ability to look across the divide of the unknown and see not a threat to be managed or a curiosity to be categorized, but a reflection of our own complex, multifaceted humanity. The tragedy at Asu Bay forces us to confront the limitation of our narratives. We often seek to simplify history, to distill complex, messy, and multifaceted events into digestible lessons or moral archetypes. We want the heroes to be noble, the victims to be blameless, and the conflict to be a clear, unambiguous indictment of a specific cultural failure. But the reality of Asu defies this reductionism. It exists as a space of immense moral and human complexity, where the intentions of the explorers and the imperatives of the indigenous population existed in a state of terminal, fatal friction. To acknowledge this complexity is to engage in a more mature, empathetic form of historical stewardship. It is to accept that the past is not a series of errors to be corrected, but a sequence of lived experiences that must be held with the respect and gravity they deserve. The monument on the beach, in its silent, weathered presence, invites us into this space of acknowledgement, asking us to look past our own biases and recognize the shared, fundamental weight of the history we all inhabit. Furthermore, we must recognize that the evolution of the site from a theater of death to a place of integration is the true, lasting victory of the human spirit. The decision by the local community to steward the memory of the French explorers is an act of transformative grace that should serve as a model for how we engage with our own, often painful, historical legacies. It teaches us that we are not condemned to be the prisoners of our histories. Rather, we are the architects of how those histories are integrated into our future. By making the monument a part of their own landscape, the people of Tutuila have demonstrated that it is possible to hold the past without being defined or restricted by it. They have created a model of reconciliation that is based not on the erasure of the event, but on the careful, intentional, and dignified management of the memory it leaves behind. This is a profound, subtle, and incredibly powerful assertion of agency, an assertion that says, "We were here before the ships arrived, we were here when the ships departed, and we are here to define how this history will serve the needs of the living." As we look toward the future, the lessons of Asu Bay must guide our approach to the ever-expanding reach of our modern, globalized world. We continue to explore, we continue to reach out, and we continue to encounter the other, in ways that the explorers of the 18th century could never have imagined. Yet, the essential, terrifying challenge of the encounter remains unchanged. We are still arriving, still observing, and still making decisions that have the potential to spark immense, transformative change. We must carry with us the humility that the French survivors carried back to their frigates, a humility that recognizes the limits of our knowledge, the precariousness of our positions, and the profound, humbling vastness of the world that exists beyond our own perceptions. We must learn to listen with a depth that matches our desire to speak, to observe with a clarity that matches our desire to document, and to engage with a patience that matches the immense, enduring beauty of the world we seek to explore. The story of the Asa massacre is an incomplete one, just as all history is incomplete. It is a story that refuses to grant us the comfort of a final, definitive conclusion. It leaves us with questions that will remain as long as we are a species that continues to sail toward new horizons. Why do we reach out? What is the cost of our curiosity? How do we balance our individual imperatives for survival with our collective need for understanding? These are the questions that define our humanity, the questions that drive our progress, and the questions that, in the silence of the bay, remind us of the immense, shared responsibility we have to one another. The monument remains, standing against the backdrop of the Pacific surf, a silent, humble beacon in the night of history. It reminds us that while the tides may rise and fall, and while the ships of our predecessors may have long since vanished into the dark, the truth of our encounter remains a vital, pulsing thread in the fabric of our shared existence. We find, in the final analysis, that the most important thing we can take from the Asa tragedy is the knowledge that we are all, in some capacity, survivors of our own histories. We have all inherited the traumas, the triumphs, and the unresolved questions of the past, and we are all tasked with the ongoing, daily labor of weaving those threads into a future that is, if not perfect, then at least more conscious of the cost of its own creation. We carry the memory of the bay as a lighthouse, a light that does not illuminate the path ahead so much as it illuminates the jagged, hidden reefs that lie beneath the surface of our ambitions. We are grateful for the light, even as we are humbled by the darkness it reveals. We are grateful for the story, even as we are pained by the tragedy that birthed it. And, above all, we are grateful for the enduring, resilient capacity of the human heart to find meaning in the chaos, to find connection in the distance, and to find the light of understanding in the beautiful, complex shadows of our shared, and often painful, journey through the infinite. So, let us leave the beach of Asa behind, but let us carry the truth of its silence with us. Let us hold it as a reminder that every step we take into the unknown is a step that demands the absolute best of our character, the most profound depths of our empathy, and the most consistent dedication to the principles of peace and mutual respect. Let us sail forward, knowing that the past is not a weight to hold us back, but a foundation upon which we can build a more sensitive, more aware, and more humane engagement with the world around us. The voyage continues. The surf continues to beat against the sand. The wind continues to fill the sails of our modern, complex ambitions. And as we continue to move through the vast, shimmering, and often terrifyingly beautiful expanse of our existence, let us do so with the awareness that we are all travelers, all explorers, and all participants in the same, unfolding, and infinitely precious story of what it means to truly, honestly encounter one another. The bay remains, the history remains, and the responsibility remains, waiting for the next generation of travelers to come, to listen and to learn, ever mindful of the cost of the path we have chosen to tread, and ever hopeful for the dawn of a future that is worthy of the memories we keep. The journey to the shore of Asa Bay concludes not with a finality that settles the account, but with an awakening to the perpetual nature of our historical responsibility. We have navigated the turbulent waters of the 18th century, followed the trajectory of the Boussole and the L'astrolabe, witnessed the fatal collision of Enlightenment idealism with the reality of the Pacific, and observed the slow, patient evolution of the site into a space of communal reflection. Now, as we stand at this final threshold, we must recognize that the massacre of 1787 is not merely a tragedy that occurred at a specific latitude and longitude. It is a manifestation of the eternal, unresolved dialogue between the forces of expansion and the forces of preservation. It is a dialogue that continues in our own time, reflected in every moment where we choose whether to view the other as an object of our curiosity or as a subject of our respect. The story of Asa is, at its heart, a mirror, and the reflection it casts is one that demands our unflinching honesty, our deep, sustained empathy, and our unwavering commitment to navigating the complex, often fraught, terrain of our shared humanity with a renewed sense of purpose and caution. The silence that now envelopes Asa Bay is the silence of a history that has been lived through, absorbed, and ultimately integrated into the enduring identity of the island of Tutuila. It is a silence that offers us no easy answers, no final judgments, and no relief from the burden of the past. Instead, it offers us the space to think, to reflect, and to consider the immense, heavy weight of the choices that define our existence as a global, interconnected species. When we think of Commodore Lapérouse and his ill-fated crew, we should not view them merely as the victims of a tragic miscalculation, nor should we view the Samoan participants as the agents of an incomprehensible, innate hostility. We should view them as human beings caught in a historical bottleneck, individuals who were forced to make impossible choices in a landscape that was changing beneath their feet with the sudden, violent rapidity of a changing tide. This shift in our perspective is the ultimate outcome of our long, meditative exploration of this tragedy. It allows us to move beyond the binary of the historical record and into the deeper, more complex territory of a shared, historical empathy. We must also recognize that the legacy of this tragedy is not confined to the history books or the monument on the beach. It resides in the lived experience of the community that continues to guard the site. The people of Asu have performed an act of profound, subtle wisdom by treating the site not as a graveyard, but as a landmark of their own, unbroken history. By doing so, they have neutralized the potential for the massacre to become a source of division, ensuring that it remains a site of continuity. This is a profound, subtle, and incredibly powerful assertion of agency, an assertion that says, "We were here before the ships arrived, we were here when the ships departed, and we are here to define how this history will serve the needs of the living." This approach provides us with a model for how we might manage the diverse, painful, and unresolved histories that continue to shape our modern world. It suggests that we can hold the memory of what was lost without being shackled by the weight of that loss, provided we have the courage to treat the past with the same degree of respect and intentionality that we would wish for our own legacies. As we look toward the future of how we understand our interconnected, globalized existence, the lessons of Asu Bay must guide our approach. We continue to explore, we continue to reach out, and we continue to encounter the other in ways that the explorers of the 18th century could never have imagined. Yet, the essential, terrifying challenge of the encounter remains unchanged. We are still arriving, still observing, and still making decisions that have the potential to spark immense, transformative change. We must carry with us the humility that the French survivors carried back to their frigates, a humility that recognizes the limits of our knowledge, the precariousness of our positions, and the profound, humbling vastness of the world that exists beyond our own perceptions. We must learn to listen with a depth that matches our desire to speak, to observe with a clarity that matches our desire to document, and to engage with a patience that matches the immense, enduring beauty of the world we seek to explore. The story of the Asa massacre is an incomplete one, just as all history is incomplete. It is a story that refuses to grant us the comfort of a final, definitive conclusion. It leaves us with questions that will remain as long as we are a species that continues to sail toward new horizons. Why do we reach out? What is the cost of our curiosity? How do we balance our individual imperatives for survival with our collective need for understanding? These are the questions that define our humanity, the questions that drive our progress, and the questions that, in the silence of the bay, remind us of the immense, shared responsibility we have to one another. The monument remains, standing against the backdrop of the Pacific surf, a silent, humble beacon in the night of history. It reminds us that while the tides may rise and fall, and while the ships of our predecessors may have long since vanished into the dark, the truth of our encounter remains a vital, pulsing thread in the fabric of our shared existence. We find, in the final analysis, that the most important thing we can take from the Asa tragedy is the knowledge that we are all, in some capacity, survivors of our own histories. We have all inherited the traumas, the triumphs, and the unresolved questions of the past, and we are all tasked with the ongoing, daily labor of weaving those threads into a future that is, if not perfect, then at least more conscious of the cost of its own creation. We carry the memory of the bay as a lighthouse, a light that does not illuminate the path ahead so much as it illuminates the jagged, hidden reefs that lie beneath the surface of our ambitions. We are grateful for the light, even as we are humbled by the darkness it reveals. We are grateful for the story, even as we are pained by the tragedy that birthed it. And, above all, we are grateful for the enduring, resilient capacity of the human heart to find meaning in the chaos, to find connection in the distance, and to find the light of understanding in the beautiful, complex shadows of our shared, and often painful, journey through the infinite. So, let us leave the beach of Asa behind, but let us carry the truth of its silence with us. Let us hold it as a reminder that every step we take into the unknown is a step that demands the absolute best of our character, the most profound depths of our empathy, and the most consistent dedication to the principles of peace and mutual respect. Let us sail forward, knowing that the past is not a weight to hold us back, but a foundation upon which we can build a more sensitive, more aware, and more humane engagement with the world around us. The voyage continues. The surf continues to beat against the sand. The wind continues to fill the sails of our modern, complex ambitions. And as we continue to move through the vast, shimmering, and often terrifyingly beautiful expanse of our existence, let us do so with the awareness that we are all travelers, all explorers, and all participants in the same unfolding and infinitely precious story of what it means to truly, honestly encounter one another. The bay remains, the history remains, and the responsibility remains, waiting for the next generation of travelers to come, to listen, and to learn, ever mindful of the cost of the path we have chosen to tread, and ever hopeful for the dawn of a future that is worthy of the memories we keep, and for the peace that comes when we finally understand that our journey was never about the discovery of the world, but about the discovery of ourselves within the profound, interconnected, and enduring life of the whole.